you all for logging on today to our NUI Galway Rural Studies Centre seminar series for 2022. And this is our second series in our second talk in this series. And it's great. We've had a fantastic reaction so far from different people. I'll actually say all over the world, because we had an unbelievable collection of people who logged on last week or last month to join us for our first seminar. So we are delighted the way it's going, and we're delighted again, of course, that you've all logged on today. So I suppose just to kind of to reiterate a little bit, the whole idea for the seminar series is to bring together people who are engaged in research related to rural issues, rural aspects of life, let that be, I suppose, rural living, rural development, or even agriculture. And bringing all of those people who are involved in that, I suppose not just researchers like ourselves, any stakeholders, participants of rural development projects or programs. We will also have those people presenting as well over the coming months. So again, the idea is we did feel ourselves, and we did a little bit of research in the background to, I suppose, discover that people were already involved in a lot of interactive kind of models online. So we did feel that for our model here, it was very much allowing the presenter to present their research, having a short time afterwards for Q&A, possibly Q&A over maybe the chat. So if you have a question that you'd like to put to John during the presentation, please put it into the chat. And I've got Aisling Murta and Louise Weir, who are here with me today as well. And both Aisling and Louise are part of our Rural Studies Centre in Galway. They're both researchers in the Studies Centre, and Shane Conway as well here. Shane is also a researcher in the Rural Studies Centre. So all three will be assisting and helping out. So without further ado, I'm going to most definitely welcome John Daly, who is our presenter today. And John has worked as an economist in both the private and the public sector over the last 7 years. And in 2021, John became the economist of the Northern and Western Regional Assembly. So I suppose such a role involves undertaking economic research related to regional development and supporting the implementation and monitoring of regional, spatial and economic strategies of the Northern and Western region, and assisting elected members of the Assembly. So I suppose prior to John's time in the Assembly, John worked as a joint economist of the 3 regional assemblies of Ireland and as an economist in DKM Economic Consultants and EY Economic Advisory Services. But at the moment, he's speaking to us via his role, I suppose, in the economic strategy of the Northern and Western Regional Assembly. So John, thanks very much for coming on board to present your research today. So I'll let you share your screen and take over from here.
Thanks, Dr. Farrell. I'm just going to try and share the screen now, and hopefully it actually works, which would be a great start anyway, you know. You can see that okay, everyone? You can see the screen okay?
Perfect, John. Yeah, thanks.
Great stuff. So thanks very much for the opportunity to speak here today. As Dr. Farr was saying, my name is John Daly. I'm the economist of the Northern Western Regional Assembly. So today I'll be giving you a detailed presentation on our recent research titled The Regional Vacancy and Dereliction Analysis. And just before I begin, I just want to say thanks to NUIG, and specifically Dr. Farrell, Dr. Conway and the rest of the NUIG team in organising this event. The Assembly very much supports these kind of events and very much feel it's going to further inform policymakers of kind of the challenges, I suppose, and the opportunities, you know, facing rural Ireland, and very much looking forward to the remaining seminar series. But in terms of my own presentation, I suppose the structure of it is as follows. So the first section, we're going to give you a very brief overview of what the North Western Regional Assembly does. Section 2, then we'll actually get into the analysis itself. We'll give you an overview of the analysis, giving you a sense of content, the purpose of the analysis, and the kind of data sources we use to develop the findings. Section 3, then we'll show you the scale of residential vacancy and dereliction in the Northern Western region based on our use of geodirectory data. Section 4, then we'll do the same, except we'll be looking at the level of vacancy in terms of commercial properties. Section 5 then will show you our findings in terms of wastewater capacity using Irish water data, and then taking all this into account, Section 16 kind of the presentation kind of outlines our policy recommendations and what we want to see reflected in the implementation of the recently announced Town Centre First Plan, and any other initiatives that essentially aim to reduce vacancy and dereliction. But before I get into the analysis, I said it was very important that I kind of give you a sense of what the Northern Western Regional Assembly as an organisation do. So the Assembly is essentially one of the three regional assemblies of Ireland, with the regional assemblies essentially acting as essentially regional authorities in Ireland, sitting between central government and county councils. As I said, there's three regional assemblies of Ireland, and this includes the Southern Regional Assembly, which, as you see in the red, covers basically Munster in the southeast, the Eastern Midland Region Assembly, which covers the Greater Dublin area and the Midlands. And then there's the Northern Western Regional Assembly, which I'm the economist of, and we'd be the most rural-orientated regional assembly area. We would cover the 9 local authorities, say, of Galway County, Galway City, Mayo, Roscommon, Leitrim, Cavan, Monaghan, and Donegal. So basically, the blue and the top left there of the map of Ireland, and our 25 county councillors would sit on our regional assembly, having been nominated by their respective county council. I suppose specifically our overarching remit of the Northern Western Regional Assembly is essentially to support balanced regional development in the Northern Western region. And we have a number of responsibilities in this regard. I suppose our core responsibility is to develop and support the implementation of the Northern Western region's regional, spatial and economic strategy, which is on the right-hand side of the slide. So this statutory document is essentially part of Project Ireland 2040's framework, and essentially aims to provide a strategic investment framework for the Northern Western region in order to manage population and employment growth in the region sustainably up to 2032 and support the implementation, obviously, of the vision and objectives of the National Planning Framework. Other responsibilities of our Assembly is essentially about supporting the 9 local authorities of the Northern Western region with their county and city development plans, ensuring they align with the National Planning Framework and obviously our regional spatial economic strategy. We also manage funds from the European Regional Development Fund, and we are the designated managing authority of the Northern Western Regional Operational Programme, which essentially covers the EU funding period of 2021 to 2027. We obviously assist our elected county councillors who have been nominated to the Assembly by their appropriate local authority, and we then provide advice and develop research that will assist policymakers in supporting balanced regional development in Ireland. Hence why we developed the regional vacancy and dereliction analysis. So moving on to the actual analysis, section 2 then will give you a kind of an overview of the analysis, giving you a sense of what is the content in it, the purpose of the analysis, and the data we used. So essentially, the regional vacancy and dereliction analysis focuses on 4 key areas. Firstly, we identified the number of vacant and derelict residential properties in the Northern Western region, its counties, and its CSO-defined towns and villages. Secondly, we identified the number of vacant commercial properties in the Northern Western region in that similar geographical scale. Thirdly, we analysed the wastewater capacity of the Northern Western region, specifically in terms of the CSO's defined towns and villages. And lastly, we outlined a total of 9 recommendations that we felt should inform the implementation of the Town Centre First policy and inform the general discussion around reducing vacancy and dereliction in towns and villages. And the analysis was released in the middle of January, and it was aimed to inform the then forthcoming Town Centre First policy, which we all know has obviously been released recently. And there's a kind of number of reasons why we prepared the analysis, but at a high level, essentially we wanted to inform policymakers of the sheer scale of vacancy and dereliction within the Northern Western region and inform the implementation of the Town Centre First policy. But in terms of specific reasons, firstly, we wanted to support the implementation of our regional policy objective 3.6 of our regional spatial economic strategy. And that essentially aims to support a consistent approach in the identification and monitoring of vacancy hotspots within the region and informing the setting of actions, objectives and targets of the plan. Secondly, we wanted to assist in the implementation of Housing for All, as the 3 regional assemblies of Ireland are the lead bodies in implementing Housing Policy Objective 19.5, which aims to harness the European Regional Development Fund to tackle vacancy and dereliction in towns. Thirdly, we wanted to inform the Town Centre First policy and provided evidence to the Department of Housing that such a policy needs to be directed at the Northern Western region in particular, given that vacancy and dereliction rates are so high in the region, as you'll see. And this has become more relevant since the 3 regional assemblies of Ireland will be given a designated action under the newly released Town Centre First Plan. And finally, we wanted to assist our regional local stakeholders in developing policies, but also in supporting them in their requirements as part of our 2-year resource monitoring report. So basically, the 2-year resource monitoring report essentially requires relevant national, regional, local stakeholders to report on their progress in implementing our regional spatial economic strategy, when again, that's under the Project Ireland 2040 framework. In terms of the data, the analysis was essentially completed using geodirectory data in terms of vacant and derelict address points, and Irish water data in terms of wastewater capacity. So the analysis of vacant and derelict properties was prepared using geodirectory commercial and residential address points data for 2015 and 2020, and the 3 regional assemblies of Ireland have a joint license agreement with geodirectory in this regard. So such a license will provide us vacant and derelict data on an annual basis, which is quite rare for data relating to counties, towns, and villages across the country, outside of obviously the census. And geodirectory themselves are a part of On Posts, and they essentially provide databases on residential and commercial address points across every part of Ireland, showing whether an address point is occupied, whether it's vacant, whether it's derelict, and its geographical location, along with other information. But this is information in itself is collected through the postal service of On Post, with the postmen and women essentially collecting this information in their rounds when delivering a post. And it kind of represents very much an innovative approach, collecting regional and local data on a regular basis. We have utilised as well the latest Irish water data in order to identify the wastewater capacity by CSO-defined towns and villages of the Northern Western region as well. And such information is quoted in terms of population equivalents. But moving on to the first parts of the results. So section 3 will show you the findings in terms of the residential vacancy in the Northern Western region. So at a high level, the analysis found some striking results in terms of residential vacancy. So in absolute terms, the geodirectory database identified 39,035 residential address points or properties that were vacant or derelict in the Northern Western region in 2020, accounting for just under 40% of the total number of vacant and derelict residential properties in Ireland. Technically, geodirectory refer to this information as address points, but for the sake of this presentation, I'm going to be referring to them as properties, just for ease of mind. But nevertheless, this is considerably high, obviously, given that obviously the Northern Western region only accounts for 17.6% of Ireland's population as of 2020. And also given that the absolute number of vacant and derelict residential properties in the region is higher than Ireland's annual housing requirement of around 33,000 homes per annum, as per Housing for All's estimates. But that's just a starting point, and such statistics going to give you a high level sense of the scale of vacancy and dereliction in the Northern Western region. So figure 1 then shows the residential vacancy rate of the Northern Western region versus the state average as of September 2020. And as evident from figure 1, the residential vacancy rate of the Northern Western region was 10.1% as of 2020. And this, of course, implies that 10.1% of the region's residential stock is classified as either vacant or derelict. And this is more than twice as high as this national average of 4.9%, showing you that vacancy and dereliction as a share of the overall stock in terms of residential stock is quite prevalent in the Northern Western region. Although it's not on the screen, the Northern Western region also recorded the highest residential vacancy rate out of the 3 NUTS 2 regions of Ireland, which are essentially the designated regions under Project Ireland 2040 or the National Planning Framework. One of the real benefits of the geodirectory data, though, is that it allows you to drill down into county data. So figure 2 shows the residential vacancy rates of the counties of the Northern Western region versus the state average in 2020. And as you can see from the graphic, all 8 counties based in the Northern Western region recorded a residential vacancy rate above the national average, highlighting the degree to which vacancy and dereliction is affecting the counties of the region. So of the 8 counties, Leitrim recorded the highest residential vacancy rate at 16%, which was 3 times higher than the national average, and implying that nearly 1 in 5 residential properties in Leitrim were either vacant or derelict as of September 2020. And as you can see, this is followed by Roscommon at 14%, Mayo at 13.6%, Sligo at 10.4%, and then Donegal at 10.3%. The only counties that recorded a residential vacancy rate below the 10% mark, yet above the national average, as you can see, were Cavan, Monaghan, and Galway. But then the geodirectory database obviously shows us in absolute numbers of residential properties that are classified as vacant or derelict in the counties of the North and Western region. So you can see from the graphic there, around 8,500 residential properties were classified as either vacant or derelict in both Mayo and Donegal. Just over 7,000 residential properties were classified as vacant or derelict in Galway. Just over 4,000 in Roscommon, around 3,000 in Sligo and Cavan, just under 3,000 as well, and Leitrim, and about 1,500 residential properties were either vacant or derelict in Monaghan. But just to give you a sense of the kind of detail that is available through our analysis and the geodirectory database, I'm going to specifically focus on Leitrim, which you can see there in the previous slide had the highest residential vacancy rate in the region, and where around 3,000 residential properties were classified as either vacant or derelict. So table 1 kind of gives you another benefit of the geodirectory database in the sense that it could go down to town and village level, and in our case we asked for CSO defined towns and villages. So it's table 1 specifically shows the total number of residential properties that were classified as either vacant or derelict in CSO defined towns of Leitrim, for areas outside of the towns, villages in Leitrim, for Leitrim as a whole and for the state as a whole as of September 2020. And as evident from the blue bars at the top of the table, the first column shows the town and village in question. The second column then shows the number of residential vacancies in 2020 in terms of residential properties, pardon me. The third column then shows the residential vacancy rate as of 2020, while the black tabs at the bottom of the table then obviously show the corresponding figures for Leitrim and Ireland as a whole. So I'm not going to go through all the figures, but I'll highlight some examples just to give you a sense of it. So for example, you'll see for the first yellow line, the number of residential properties that were vacant or derelict in Carrigan-Shannon stood at 149 in 2020, with Carrigan-Shannon recording a residential vacancy rate of 7.6, which is above the national average of 4.9. As you see through the second line, the number of residential properties that were vacant in rural towns were also relatively high, with places like Drummond and Drumshanbo recording a residential vacancy rate of 9.8% each, which was above the national average. In absolute terms, it's around 42 residential properties were vacant or derelict in Drummond, and 53 were either vacant or derelict in Drumshanbo. As you'll see from the third yellow line, then the number of residential properties that were vacant in Leitrim Village stood at around 38 in 2020, with Leitrim Village recording a residential vacancy rate of 10.4%, which is notably higher compared to the national average. So overall, and as evident for the last yellow line, most of the residential properties that were classified as vacant or derelict in Leitrim were located outside of the CSO defined towns and villages, with around 2,000 vacant or derelict properties in these areas. Applying areas in Leitrim outside of the towns and villages recorded a residential vacancy rate of 21%. That's huge compared to obviously the national average. But in most cases, these areas are likely to be very rural oriented communities, but it can also be areas just on the outskirts of towns and village boundaries, but not within the CSO defined boundaries. Notably though, as you can see on the right, all of the CSO defined town boundaries or towns and villages in Leitrim recorded an above average residential vacancy rate, highlighting the degree to which vacancy and dereliction is affecting the county. Similar results are available for the other counties of the North and Western region, but I thought it was notable that just under 3,000 vacant or derelict residential properties in Leitrim were vacant as of September 2020, yet on data as of today, I saw that there was only 8 homes to rent in Leitrim and 151 homes to buy in Leitrim. So I suppose that kind of highlights the potential of regenerating these properties as kind of just a means of supporting housing supply in and of itself. But moving on though, the analysis also found some interesting results in terms of all of the CSO defined towns and villages in the North and Western region. So you can see there from figure 4 on the pie chart, of the 244 towns and villages with a CSO defined settlement boundary based in the North and Western region, just over 70% recorded a residential vacancy rate above the national average of 4.9. In contrast, only 28% of the towns and villages based in the North and Western region registered a below average residential vacancy rate. And again, I suppose it gives you the sense of the degree to which towns and villages in Ireland's most rural oriented region are affected by this issue. But moving on then, section 4 then will now show you our findings in terms of commercial vacancy rate in the North and Western region. So at a regional level, the analysis also found some striking high level results in the fact that just under 6,000 commercial properties were vacant in the North and Western region in 2020. And that counts for about a quarter of the total number of vacant commercial properties in Ireland. Again, this of course is very high when you consider this to the northern western region's population of Ireland, consider its share of the labour market or even in the enterprise base. So it's quite a high number. And just as a starting point, it gives you a sense of the scale of vacancy and dereliction in the region. But in terms of figure 5, then that shows that commercial vacancy rate of the northern western region compared to the state average. Again, as evident from figure 5, the commercial vacancy rate of the northern western region is higher than the residential vacancy rate at 13.3%, but relative to the national average, the northern western region's commercial vacancy rate was around 2 percentage points higher than the corresponding state average of 11.4%. Again, although it's not in the graphic, the northern western region again is recorded the highest commercial vacancy rate out of the 3 NUTS 2 regions of Ireland. Again, the regions that are designated under Project Ireland 2040. And figure 16 shows the commercial vacancy rate of the counties of the northern western region versus the state average in 2020. As you can see from the graphic, 6 out of the 8 counties based in the region recorded a commercial vacancy rate above the national average of 11.4%. Of the 8 counties, Sligo had the highest commercial vacancy rate at 16.8%, which was just over 5 percentage points above the national average, and implying that nearly 1 in 5 commercial properties in Sligo were vacant as of September 2020. And this is followed by Donegal at 14.2, Galway at 13.4, Mayo at 13.3, and Roscommon as well at 13.1. And the only counties in the region recorded a commercial vacancy rate below the national average was Monaghan at 11.3 and Cavan at 10.2. Going forward then, figure 7 shows the absolute number of commercial properties classified as vacant in the counties of the region. As you can see from the graphic, around 2,000 commercial properties were classified as vacant in Galway. Just over 1,000 were classified as vacant in Donegal. Again, just under 1,000 were vacant in Mayo. Around 600 were vacant in Sligo. 417 were vacant in both Roscommon and Monaghan, while 395 commercial properties were vacant in Cavan and 244 commercial properties were vacant in Leitrim. But again, just to give you a sense of the detail available through the analysis, specifically going to focus on Sligo this time, which give you a sense of the type of areas that are most and least affected by commercial vacancy rates. So specifically, we're going to focus on the difference in performance between rural-orientated towns, say, that generally relied on small family-owned retailers or kind of labour-intensive industries, such as say agriculture or manufacturing, versus rural coastal towns and villages that say have a strong tourist trade. And the difference is quite striking. So for example, as you can see in the first yellow line, the number of commercial properties that were vacant in the rural town of Ballymote stood at 19 in 2020, while Ballymote had a commercial vacancy rate above the national average of 15.8%. Moving along, you'll see there again the number of commercial properties that were vacant in Colooney, again another rurally oriented town in Sligo, stood at 46 in 2020, while Colooney had a commercial vacancy rate of nearly 29.9%, which is well above the state average. As you can see again, Grange, with the number of commercial properties that were vacant, stood at 15 in 2020, while Grange had a commercial vacancy rate of 30%, again well above the national average. And all of these towns would be quite, that have just been highlighted, just be quite rural orientated, and based on our NACE code data, which we would got through GeoDirectory as well, they're quite reliant on, say, small independent retailers who, for reasons, say, such as online shopping, out of town shopping and discount pricing, they've seen a lot of business closures and thereby a rise in commercial vacancies. In contrast, and as you can see from the fourth blue line, coastal rural towns and villages, say, that would be popular with visitors and tourists, generally recorded much lower commercial vacancy rates, both in absolute terms and as a percentage. So, for example, there's only one commercial property in Ross's Point that was classified as vacant as of September 2020, which is considerably low, obviously, commercial vacancy rate of 4.2%. But a similar strong performance also seen in Strandhill, again, with these areas offering a strong tourism offering, and the resultant economic activity in the town centre is likely to be driving this positive performance. That said, it doesn't always hold, I suppose, in, say, for example, in Sligo town, the number of vacant commercial properties stood at 341 as of September 2020, while Sligo town had a commercial vacancy rate of just over 20%, which is notably high against the national average of 11.4%. But I suppose you would be aware of this information anecdotally, I suppose, but it's more that such evidence base kind of is provided to prove that rural-oriented towns would have, say, a strong tourism offer to fall back on, that they've been notably affected by wider consumer trends and been notably affected in recent years. And it's good to have this kind of evidence base. The analysis also found as well some interesting results in terms of the overall number of towns and villages on a regional level. So of the 244 towns and villages, again, with a CSO-defined settlement boundary based in the Northern Western region, just under 60% recorded a commercial vacancy rate above the national average of 11.4. And in contrast, 41% of the towns and villages registered a below average commercial vacancy rate. Again, it's kind of shown since the region is affected both in terms of commercial vacancies as well as residential vacancies as well. But overall, when we take everything into account, there was around just under 45,000 vacant or derelict properties located in the Northwestern region, which is obviously considerably high given that Ireland's experiencing an ongoing housing shortage. Notably, 37% of residential and commercial properties that were classified as vacant or derelict in the Northwestern region. And that's obviously considerably high, given the region only accounts for 17.6% of Ireland's population. But when you look at these kind of collective numbers, we obviously see the potential of renovating vacant and derelict properties, not only as a means, obviously, of increasing housing supply, but also, say, a means of obviously regenerating town and village centres, and as a means of supporting compact growth and reducing urban sprawl. And the potential to support compact growth and reduce urban sprawl is notably evident, say, from Figure 9, which shows the geographical location of the 44,905 vacant and derelict properties in the Northern Western region. And we show whether these properties are located in a CSO-defined town and village or in areas outside of the towns and village. And as you can see from Figure 9, 34.4% of vacant and derelict properties in the Northern Western region were already located within the existing built-up footprint of the towns and villages. So they're already effectively in the centre of the towns already. So in absolute terms, that amounts to about 15,000 odd vacant or derelict properties within the existing built-up footprint of the Northern Western region's towns and villages. And these kind of centrally located properties offer great potential to support, say, the implementation of compact growth targets in the National Planning Framework and the Regional Spatial Economic Strategy, all of which should make, say, communities more walkable, reducing people's reliance on private cars, and placing them closer, say, to services, public modes of transports, but also making the centre of towns and villages kind of economic and social and cultural hubs again, all of which, again, should enhance quality of life, but also, and from an environmental perspective, can reduce urban sprawl and needless carbon emissions. But moving on, Section 5 in the presentation shows our analysis of wastewater capacity in our CSO-defined towns and villages. And look, the availability of, I suppose, wastewater capacity may not be a barrier to redeveloping vacant or derelict property in areas that have an established connection, but it can in some cases be a barrier for towns and villages that are operating above the capacity of their, say, wastewater treatment plant. Therefore, as a small kind of supplementary analysis, do you simply wanted to analyse the current wastewater capacity of the Northern Western region's towns and villages and see whether these towns and villages have the capacity to support the regeneration of vacant and derelict properties located in these areas. And using the latest, say, data from Irish Water as of 2019, we identified the towns and villages of the Northern Western region that were operating above or below the capacity of their public wastewater treatment plant, while identifying the towns and villages that had no public wastewater treatment plant. I suppose specifically we want to show we did show the wastewater capacity in terms of population equivalents as of 2019, the load they receive in terms of population equivalents, and in the wastewater capacity of the plant after any upgrades, if there was any, in terms of population equivalents, and in the expected year of completions of new upgrades if they were available. And I suppose capacity in this regard is generally expressed as population equivalents, and just a very basic kind of definition of it is essentially the total organic biodegradable load of everything in the area, and it's converted to the equivalent number of population. So our actual findings in this regard, you can see them there. So in total, we found that 41 towns and villages in the Northern Western region that also have vacant and derelict properties were also found to be operating above the capacity of their public wastewater treatment plants. So in total, we also found that 40 towns and villages in the Northern Western region that also have vacant and derelict properties were found to have no public wastewater treatment plant. Look, why they don't have a wastewater treatment plant, I'm not entirely sure, for a number of reasons, say, including, say, private usage, or simply just down to the lack of absence of facilities, which, as we know, can be very environmentally damaging. But nevertheless, the absence of such infrastructure or capacity in this regard could be preventing individuals from redeveloping vacant or derelict properties, as to do so without an improvement in capacity could cause environmental damages, and authorities may not want to put the existing wastewater capacity under further pressure. But this could be just some of several reasons why vacant and derelict properties are not being redeveloped. Other ones that we've highlighted may be just the fact that the absence of taxation of vacant sites, the lack of incentives and grants, and just lack of local authority funding are likely to be preventing as well the redevelopment of these types of properties. But we'll be interested to get people's views or thoughts about what they think may be blocking as well the redevelopment of these properties. So overall, the evidence base presented in sections 3, 4, and 5 are essentially going to help inform policymakers and stakeholders that wish to tackle the level of vacancy and dereliction in towns and villages in the North and Western region. In addition to providing the evidence base that has been presented in this analysis, the North and Western Region Assembly has also made a number of recommendations that we wanted to be considered as part of the implementation of the Town Centre First policy. And such recommendations should also inform ongoing public discussion with respect to the level of vacancy and dereliction in towns and villages in Ireland. So in terms of recommendation 1, the Assembly essentially wants to see funding resources that will be used to implement the Town Centre First policy to positively discriminate towards the towns and villages of the North and Western region, given that the high number of vacant and derelict properties are located within the region. In order to apply positive discrimination towards the North and Western region, the Assembly believes that more than 37% of financial resources that are provided towards implementing the Town Centre First policy should be used and ring-fenced to regenerate towns and villages based in Northern Western region. Furthermore, we believe that there should be a role for the 3 regional assemblies of Ireland in managing and distributing such resources across the 3 NUTS 2 regions, given the knowledge of the assemblies with respect to towns and villages that are experiencing high vacancy rates, and considering the assemblies' experience as the managing authorities of the European Regional Development Fund. I suppose the logic of the 37% figure was based on the fact that 37% of all vacant and derelict properties in Ireland are located within the Northern Western region. In terms of recommendation 2, we want to see the Town Centre First policy encourage all public sector bodies, businesses and communities to put the health of towns and villages at the core of their decision making and embrace concepts such as town partnerships and business improvement districts. So in this regard, we want to see Town Centre First policy modelled, say, on the Scottish Government's Town Centre First scheme, which such a model supporting the development of, say, town partnerships and business improvement schemes. So to a certain degree, I suppose, the concept of town partnerships has been incorporated into the newly released Town Centre First policy through the announcement of, say, the National Town Centre First Office, the town regeneration officers, and the town teams idea. However, we'd like to see going forward the development of a framework that allows for further growth of, say, business improvement districts. And there's some examples in Ireland, if I remember so, but we want to see this on a much wider level. And just to give you some context, I suppose business improvement districts are essentially, in the Scottish case anyway, a part of a town, a tourism area, or a commercial district in which businesses work together to invest in local area improvements. So such districts can only be created if they get support from a clear majority of local businesses in a vote, and they are managed and paid for by businesses through a compulsory business improvement district levy. And it's been noted that business improvement districts cover almost any service or activities that the businesses agree on, which would be of benefit to the area and worth funding as long as they are additional to the services provided by, say, local authorities. So, for example, the resources raised through the levy can tackle local issues such as access, safety, security, cleaning, waste, environmental improvements, everything from improved asset management, digitalization, tourism, and even employment. Therefore, going forward, we'd love to see a greater emphasis on the development of these kind of districts in Ireland, and this should be reflected, I think, in the implementation of the Town Centre First policy going forward. Recommendation 3 then calls for the use of available funding resources from the European Regional Development Fund to support the Town Centre First policy, specifically through the Northern Western Regional Operational Programme. So resources from the European Regional Development Fund can be directed towards initiatives such as the Town Centre First policy, since it's aligned with policy objective 5 of the fund being obviously the European Regional Development Fund, as this aims for a Europe that is closer to the citizens. So basically, as per the common provision regulations of the ERDF, policy objective 5 aims to achieve a Europe which is closer to the citizens by essentially fostering sustainable development of all types of territories, including urban and non-urban settings, and essentially making them more sustainable. And this again would be in line with kind of some of the ideas of town centre first policy. Therefore, the resources from the European Regional Development Fund through the Northern Western Regional Operational Programme could be utilised to support sustainable settlement patterns by redeveloping vacant and derelict properties within town centres, provided this is agreeable, obviously, with the relevant bodies involved in the management of these funds. So currently, and this is in line with Housing for All, this usage of the ERDF funds has been reflected in the newly released Town Centre First policy, while negotiations obviously ongoing between the department and the regional assemblies and the commission in developing programs that would support the regeneration of these properties using the ERDF. I would be hopeful that an appropriate program can be developed which allows funding to reduce the number of vacant and derelict properties in the Northern Western region. And in terms of recommendation 4, the Assembly wants to see funding resources from initiatives, say, such as, but not limited to, say, the URDF, the RRDF, Town and Village Renewal Scheme, and the ERDF to explicitly support the implementation of the policy of the National Planning Framework and the Regional Spatial Economic Strategy, which is specifically the population and compact growth targets. And that funding in this regard should concentrate as well on regenerating towns and villages with an above average residential and commercial vacancy rate. I suppose our logic here is based on the fact that the National Planning Framework and the Regional Spatial Economic Strategy, their statutory frameworks, and the redevelopment of vacant and derelict properties within the centre of towns and villages will be key to supporting compact growth targets outlined in these documents. Therefore, supporting more sustainable settlement patterns in coming years and reducing our reliance on private car journeys and urban sprawl. Recommendation 5 is to develop a steering group within the department which would bring national, regional, and local stakeholders together to agree a clear and common approach to identifying the number of vacant and derelict properties and sites in towns and villages across Ireland and examine the underlying factors causing vacancy and dereliction. At the moment, there's not a whole lot of evidence showing why properties become vacant or derelict, and I think that's something that needs to be examined at a governmental level. Also, there is an issue with data in terms of the number of vacant and derelict properties that are located in towns and villages across Ireland. You know, with some organisations and commentators say relying on data from the census, from the CSO, say data from like the likes of ourselves from Geodirectory, while other bodies using different types of methodologies have collected their own private data on the number of vacant and derelict properties in these areas. We've also seen data collection from Heritage Council as well, which is quite an innovative approach as well. But depending on the methodologies that are applied in these data gathering exercises, there's quite a difference between the estimates provided by like CSO and Geodirectory. Therefore, a steering group needs, in my opinion, needs to be formed in order to collectively agree the most appropriate method of identifying vacant and derelict properties. I know there's a commitment under the Town Centre First policy to support the Heritage Council and their approach, and that'd be quite welcoming. And I suppose the kind of approach at a national level is very much needed, and I think it's committed to the Town Centre First policy. But at the moment, the Assembly is using Geodirectory, commercial and residential databases, given the fact that it's available on a national, regional, and local level, and provides a realistic estimate on the number of vacant and derelict properties across the state. But I think we need to bring a local, regional, and national stakeholders together to decide the most appropriate approach to this. Recommendation 6 then is to provide resources to local authorities based in the Northern Western region to apply a team of full-time vacant and derelict officers, ensuring each local authority can identify and tackle the level of vacancy and dereliction within their administrative area. So at the moment, each local authority can receive funding annually to provide a full-time vacant homes officer position, but considering, I suppose, the scale of the challenge, the Assembly believes that additional resources need to be provided to each local authority to hire a full team of officers, a multidisciplinary team, to not only identify the number of vacant and derelict properties on a regular basis, but also say to deliver solutions, which may include, say, providing design and project management advice, say, to property owners. We definitely need to, I think, a greater ambition in this regard. And the need for data collection as well and analysis is in line with the views of, say, key stakeholders given at the Oireachtas Committee on Housing, Local Government and Heritage, who noted that local authorities need more vacant home officers for data collection and analysis. Recommendation 7 then is to ensure that the forthcoming residential zone land tax is designed in a fair and appropriate and targeted manner, and designed in a manner which significantly penalises the owners of vacant and derelict properties and sites that, without reasonable justification, fail to redevelop these properties within the centre of towns and villages. I suppose the primary purpose of this kind of annual tax should be to stimulate the redevelopment of empty properties and sites within towns and villages, and by penalising the owners of idle properties and sites without reasonable justification fail to renovate these assets. And I suppose reasonable justification in this case could relate to the health and well-being of an owner or other factors which restrict genuine efforts, say, to redevelop these properties. So, for example, planning delays or something to that extent. And furthermore, the proposed residential zone land tax should be levied at a rate which is higher than the annual rate of land inflation in that geographical area in question. Albeit, in my own opinion, we may need to go further in the future and maybe apply and develop a site value tax in the coming years, but it remains to be seen how the residential zone land tax will be designed by the Department of Finance in the coming period. Recommendation 8 then calls in for the Department of Housing to commission a study which examines the merits of utilising policy instruments, such as tax relief, subsidies, rebates, low-cost loans, and other financial incentives, as a means of encouraging individuals to redevelop vacant and derelict properties in towns and villages. To what degree these types of policy instruments kind of significantly encourage the redevelopment of vacant and derelict properties in an Irish context remains to be seen, albeit they're likely, some of them, to have a positive impact in encouraging regeneration. Therefore, for that reason, the department should examine the merits of these policy instruments in encouraging the redevelopment of vacant and derelict properties, and whether such measures achieve their objectives and provide value for money, essentially, to the Exchequer. And considering the high number of vacant and derelict properties within the region, the department's research should focus on towns and villages in the northern western region as a case study. And finally, then, recommendation 9 then calls for sufficient funding to provide access to or address the wastewater treatment capacity of the northern western region's towns and villages that are operating above the capacity of their wastewater treatment plant, or if they have no public wastewater treatment plant or no private one. And while providing adequate capacity to accommodate future population and employment growth in line with the recess of the northern western region. I suppose the provision of adequate wastewater treatment capacity, we have this in because it's a key component to supporting future population and employment growth in towns and villages across the northern western region, while ensuring that the resultant growth doesn't affect our region's natural assets and environment. Our logic here was based on the fact that the region will experience significant population and employment growth in the coming years. So, for example, under the National Planning Framework, by 2040, the overall population of the northwestern region is expected to grow by around 180,000 people, with an employment uplift of 115,000. So ensuring such growth can be accommodated in a sustainable manner will require the provision of adequate wastewater treatment capacity throughout the region. And since we felt such a recommendation was justified based on the fact that 81 towns and villages in the northwestern region are either operating above their wastewater treatment capacity or had no public wastewater treatment plant. So to summarise, the regional vacancy and dereliction analysis has allowed us to inform policymakers of the sheer scale of vacancy and dereliction within the northwestern region, and it crucially has allowed us to implement a key regional policy objective in our regional spatial economic strategy. It would also support the Assembly's designated housing policy objective on housing for all and our action under Town Centre First policy, while it will assist our regional and local and national stakeholders in their obligations under the 2-year recess monitoring report. To summarise the findings, just under 45,000 vacant or derelict properties were located in the northern western region, which is obviously considerably high given the ongoing housing shortage. Notably, 37% of these properties that are classified as vacant or derelict are located within the northern western region, despite the region only counting 17.6% of Ireland's population. Notably, 34.4% of vacant and derelict properties in the northwestern region were already located within the existing built-up footprint of the towns and villages. And in absolute terms, that amounts to about 15,000 vacant or derelict homes located within the centre of towns and villages already. So that kind of gives you a sense of the potential to utilise this stock and reduce urban sprawl. And finally, it's striking that nearly just over 70% of towns and villages in the northwest recorded an above average residential vacancy rate, while 59% of the towns and villages in the region recorded an above average commercial vacancy rate. And just to finish, again, just to say thank you very much for listening to the presentation, and thank you NUIG for the opportunity to present the regional vacancy and dereliction analysis. This seminar is very much something we support, and look, I'm happy to take any questions or just hear your general thoughts about how we as a region and how we as a state kind of can reduce residential vacancy and dereliction as a means of improving housing supply, regenerating towns and villages, and in reducing urban sprawl. Thanks very much.
John, thanks a million. There is just so much there. My head is even blown. There's so much that we can ask. There's so many questions I could ask myself. But I'm not going to do that. I'm going to hand it over. I suppose, first of all, I suppose there's so much there that is relevant as well to our partners in the Department of Rural and Community Development. Exactly what we've been saying all along, that this type of evidence-based research for our policymakers, for our practitioners on the ground, is exactly what's needed from everybody, for us as educators and researchers, for the practitioners in rural development. This is exactly the type of research that we need on the ground. The chat has absolutely lit up. So I'm going to hand it over to two wonderful researchers that we have, Aisling Murtagh and Louise Weir. So I'm going to maybe ask Aisling to come in first and maybe put some questions to John that have been coming in on the chat.
I might jump in, Maura. Between us, we were going through them. John, you haven't made our job easy by any manner of means. But yeah, it's a great follow on from Dr. Ford at our last seminar series, having this evidence-based research going forward to line up to the funding streams that were mentioned the last time is absolutely vital. And using these buildings will allow the critical mass in rural areas that will allow future development. We have numerous themes across the different questions, John, and it's part of the seminar series. The advantage of it is where we see all across the board, people are putting up other further research studies. You can look through them yourself. Alison mentions town centre health check. Jim Copeland really gave a really interesting one. You mentioned the Scottish empty home partnership, and maybe consider the use of our language around this, maybe not dereliction, maybe something like empty homes. I thought it was really interesting. Cian O'Callaghan put up some other research. Dr. Mann has a very good insight here where and it captures a lot of the themes that came through it, and this idea of only targeting dereliction as one issue. And from findings, she's noting that maybe dereliction needs to be part of a broader approach to dereliction, because it in itself won't solve dereliction. It needs to be part of a broader scheme. Also exercised throughout the whole thing is this idea or linked to rural housing. And one question here: is there a strong concentration of one-off bills in terms of vacant residential properties in rural areas? And if so, does it decrease their utility in addressing the housing issues when at present our policies are trying to reduce this one-off housing in rural areas, John? So even though we have a lot of dereliction statistics for rural areas, can it truly address housing issues if we're not letting housing in rural areas? Other questions then are all across the analysis and how you approached it, and maybe they could be sent directly to you. There's about 15 or 20 of them, so maybe those broader things to respond to first, John.
Thanks, Louise. I'm just kind of was going down through the lists as well. I was just ticking off some that I can answer fairly quickly. Well, I think one was asked, are holiday homes included? Geodirectory separate those from the data. So the numbers I would have quoted there, holiday homes would be excluded from them. The difference between vacancy and dereliction, that's an important one, because it's kind of there is a distinction between it. Under Geodirectory's definitions, essentially they come down to the degree to which repair is involved. So, for example, under their definitions, a vacant property is a property that's either say vacant and ready to be lived in right now. Vacant would require, say, a small amount of repair work to make it livable again. What I said, Geodirectory's definition of vacant property would exclude, say, temporary vacancies. So, for example, if someone went on holidays, say someone temporarily left the home because obviously their address their name is attached to the address, so it would really require them to leave the address before this comes down as a long-term vacancy, and no one obviously has moved in since. I suppose in contrast, in a derelict property is a property that is also empty, but it's considered in such a state of disrepair that it's going to require a significant amount of renovations and construction work in order to make this dwelling livable again. So, for example, there'll be broken windows, there'll be no roof, the doors will be falling off. So ultimately, the degree of repair involved in the property generally explains the difference between vacancy and dereliction. In terms of the one-off housing issue, it's true in the sense of that most of the based on the data anyway, because the National Planning Framework essentially defines the kind of existing built-up footprints of town and village centres as the CSO defines settlement boundary. As you can see from the statistics there, most, albeit a sizable minority, are based within the centre of towns and villages. But there's quite a number as well, obviously, in terms of, say, one-off vacant and derelict kind of homes that would be based, all likelihood, probably based in the countryside. And in terms of tackling them, to what degree utilities have an effect on it, I'm not quite entirely sure, but I think ultimately, I think there's kind of three issues that need to be dealt with in terms of kind of encouraging greater regeneration of vacant and derelict properties, both in terms of, say, one-off areas, but also in terms of town centres. I think it is down to vacant taxes in terms of that we need to get serious about in terms of the application. Say, for example, the forthcoming residential zone land tax, that's going to be a big issue. The applications in of grants and in tax incentives and subsidies, essentially some kind of financial instruments to assist individuals that wish to regenerate these vacant and derelict properties. They need to be provided some kind of support. I know Minister Darragh O'Brien has spoken of a €30,000 or limit of €30,000 first-time buyer grant that would help first-time buyers essentially regenerate vacant and derelict properties. I think though that may need to be expanded. I think first-time buyers, potentially myself, is going to be one probably a year, generally tend to be risk averse, wouldn't go near a vacant derelict property. I think that's going to need to be expanded for maybe more mature buyers that have more capital and that will be more willing to take a risk on, say, a vacant and derelict property, which, you know, some of them can be quite easy to redevelop. Some of them, quite frankly, just need to be bulldozed to the ground, and some quite a lot of issues structurally and from an engineering perspective. So I suppose that I think that's I'm trying to go through the rest of it now in terms of the questions anyway. But if I need,
Ashton probably has some more there for you, John.
Yeah, thanks, John. That has covered a lot, actually. I think you've touched on a lot of the points that people raised. I think just one thing that jumped out was kind of around kind of the legal barriers, perhaps, to regenerating some of these properties. And is there a role for compulsory sale? The title ownership, where does that lie? And that some of these properties maybe are in historic town centres. I don't know if you can say anything around this, and whose responsibility? Is it a number of agencies that need to get involved? And I think in terms of another area of questioning is around kind of, you touched on it in terms of the more tourist areas that have, this is a lesser problem, but the kind of drivers, I suppose, of this issue. And then I guess that kind of asks for a certain response. In some of the comments, there's this idea that it's social, it's economic, which makes this quite a difficult issue to deal with from the legal, technical side to the wider development concerns. So that's a big question, if you have any thoughts.
Yeah, I think in terms of the compulsory purchase orders, compulsory sales orders, I think there is obviously a certain degree of role for obviously those kind of policy instruments, and there's no doubt about it. I think though from feedback we've received, say, from local authorities, and also since I'm the only economist in the Northern Western Regional Assembly, but I work with an awful lot of planners, and the general feedback from them was that although there is a role for it, it can be quite a costly role in terms of that. It can take quite a lot of time. It can be very time consuming in terms of processing a compulsory purchase order, and it can be quite expensive as well. Therefore, maybe more wider policy instruments, say, for example, as I said, the residential zone land tax, the provision of more grants and subsidies. And then pardon me, the last one I meant to say was that additional funding for local authorities. So at the moment, for example, local authorities, a circular was circulated to from the department, which stated that the department will be providing, I think, €60,000 a year for local authorities and funding to deliver a vacant homes officer. And I think just having one vacant home officer per local authorities is not really going to help tackle this issue. Just in terms of our own local authorities, that would imply there'll be 9 local authorities in the Northern Western region. That's 9 local vacant homes derelict officers to tackle 45,000 vacant and derelict homes. That's quite a significant ask, and I really feel that there needs to be a kind of a wider kind of multidisciplinary team brought in to kind of address this issue. But in terms of the tourist areas versus the kind of, I suppose, the more rural oriented areas, a good example, and I would have seen a lot mentioned in kind of regional, local radios when speaking of them, was Ballahadreen in Roscommon versus Westport in Mayo. Because Ballahadreen is where the Northern Western Regional Assembly's HQ is located. And it's one of these kind of large old market towns that a lot of history, but unfortunately due to trends, say online shopping, out of town shopping, kind of discount pricing through to kind of large supermarkets, their kind of main commercial base has been small time retailers. And they obviously have seen like a lot of businesses foreclose, a lot of businesses simply can't compete with these kind of factors. And then all of a sudden you see high commercial vacancy rates arising, and also obviously a lot of kind of business closures as well. The opposite then with Westport then is that obviously its entire experience of Westport, obviously it's one of the leading tourist areas in the country, never mind the Northern Western region, and its entire experience is based on its tourism offering, and of course its economic activity is directed directly into the center of its town. So you can see that, say for example, Westport has below average residential and commercial vacancy rates. So I think while there might be legal issues, say actually in terms of say historical sites, etc., I think there is wider economic factors I think are kind of the main driver behind these kind of vacancies, which are doing poor, which are doing quite well. I think legal issues are kind of, and I'm only an economist now, I suppose today, but legal issues are obviously widespread across the country, and these issues had to be dealt with everywhere. But I think ultimately economic factors are the kind of main reason that might explain the difference performances between different areas, in terms of tourism areas versus say more traditional historically market oriented rural towns.
Okay, John, I suppose just to one of the things that we said about the seminar series all along is that we would stick to the hour on the last Wednesday of every month from 3 to 4. So I think we're going to, even though there's still a number of questions there, that maybe we will pass all on to John and he might be able to get back, or else hopefully he's already answered some of them already. And I think, John, all of this research is already up on your own website. We have a recording of this now, and it will go up on our own YouTube website as well for the seminar series. So I suppose without further ado, I want to sincerely thank John for what I think was a really interesting presentation. Raises so many questions for us. It brings to life, I think, exactly what's happening within a rural context, within the West of Ireland context. And I suppose behind all of those figures, behind all of those numbers, behind all of those derelict sites and vacancies, there are, I suppose, opportunities. There are stories behind them all, but there are also opportunities. There are opportunities for everything we talk about now in relation to smart villages, remote working, all of the type of social, economic, cultural kind of activities that we need, I suppose, to keep rural Ireland alive. They are all within, I suppose, looking behind a lot of those figures. And I suppose the level of interest that has been in John's presentation really has already been picked up. And John presented his work via the Rural Voices seminar series on Countrywide last Saturday morning. I see Galway Bay FM are here as well, looking for some more information via John. The Irish Hardware Association are online as well here, looking for some information as well via John. So it really has ignited people's interest in this area. So from that point of view, I want to sincerely thank John for coming on board and presenting the research to everybody here today. Just again, I want to thank sincerely Aisling and Louise for coming in and out with the questions. It's been fantastic. Shane Conway, as always, for being hugely in the background of this, being on the right-hand side of this on a continuous basis. And I suppose making sure that we get everybody connected, but also connecting with you before and afterwards as well. So the full team in the Rural Studies Centre in NUI Galway, thanks a million. For John Daly, sincere thanks, John, for coming on board and presenting. To all of you for joining us today, thank you very, very much. We have a really interesting presentation coming about again on the last Wednesday of March, and we will disseminate a lot of that material in the coming days, and we will get out there exactly what it's all about. So join us as well again at the end of March. Again, thanks to John.